Hello and welcome, I'm Kalle. As you can tell from the title, we are going to play through Final Fantasy I with only 4 white mages. More specifically, we are going to play through the Pixel Remaster version, which has some differences from the NES release, so let me just briefly go through them. At least the most important ones. First, obviously bug fixes. Stuff like agility works properly and most of the game is not broken anymore. Then, enemy stats. Mostly bosses, I believe. They are the same as in the PSP and GBA ports rather than the original. It won't matter too much, but Chaos for example has 20k HP instead of 5k. And lastly, for the first time, the boss's AI is random. They don't follow an attack pattern anymore like they did in all the previous releases, which means that fights are going to be more luck-based and less predictable. That's it. There are other small changes, but they are not really worth mentioning. Now it's time to talk about the stars of our run. The white mages themselves. If you know a bit about Final Fantasy, you should know that white mages are healers, meaning that they usually aren't able to deal much damage, unless the enemy is an undead, of course. And that's exactly how it is in this game. They cannot really hit hard, but they do have a plethora of spells that keeps your party healthy. And you can see them in the table I made. Yeah, I know it's not great, but I like the style. It's quite simple and understandable, I hope. And to be honest, I am a bit lazy. Some spots are empty because white mages would need to promote white wizards in order to use those spells, and that's a thing we are not allowed to do, of course. But it doesn't really matter too much. All the stuff that we actually need is there. And I'm talking about Blink and Protect, and obviously Protera, which is just a stronger Protect. That's because of how buffs work in this game. All buffs last for the whole battle or until the character dies. But the ones that don't give your character some sort of status effect and simply increase their stats can be casted again in order to regain that increase, meaning that they stack. And the 3 spells that I mentioned before are exactly this kind of buff. I think you can see where this is going. If we manage to set up properly, we will be basically immune to physical attacks, which helps a lot, and also means that we don't need to worry too much about our equipment. Our defensive one at least. You can see that it's not great in this other table I made. Yes, I made another table, and there's one more actually. Anyways, the only stuff that matters a lot are ribbons, given their strong effect, and unfortunately there are only 3 in this game. Defense itself is not that important for the reason I explained before, though it still helps at the beginning of the fights. That said, there's not really a lot of strong defensive equipment for white mages, and I mean with high defensive stats obviously. Well, not like their offensive selection is better. It's actually worse. In this last table, you can see that they have like 5 or 6 weapons they can use, and basically none of them is good. They will be stuck with Mithril hammers for most of the game, and one character by the end will get the Masamune, but that's it. Thankfully, we can survive a lot, so at least there's that. The overview about the white mages is over, and I can almost talk about the run itself. But I still have a short premise before that. What you are seeing right now are random battles that I lost. And there have been a lot of them. I'll just let you know here that they have been basically the biggest issue of this run. Enemies always hit fairly hard for when they are in the game, and it's not really worth fighting them, given our limited amount of spells. So I tend to flee. And fleeing doesn't always work. That's why I lost a lot. Okay, that was the last thing I wanted to say before talking about the run itself. And let's just do it. The beginning is extremely easy. Garland and the pirates in Pravoka are a complete joke, you are seeing them right now being decimated. My level was a bit higher than normal for those fights, but I later tried again at a lower level and they were still as easy. The first roadblock are the Pisco demons in the Marsh Cave. I think that's how you pronounce it, I'm not too sure. What I'm sure of is that they hit extremely hard while we do not. And that's not good, obviously. I ended up wiping extremely quickly, so I decided to gain one more level. Level 11 is still quite high, but it's probably enough, and try again. So I changed my strategy a bit, as you are seeing. This time around, I opted to buff a single character, rather than all of them at the same time. As long as one survives and can slowly kill the enemies, it's good enough after all. The last character is the less likely to beat, so I decided to buff them. And the strategy worked out. I only had to pay attention to critical hits, given that they partially ignore defenses, and I think they completely ignore evasion as well, but I'm not too sure about that. Next is Astos, the Dark Elf. Usually he is fairly difficult. He has a lot of spells that are quite dangerous and can debilitate your party or damage your party, but he is also not immune to silence, and silence is a white magic, and what it does, it's making enemies unable to cast spells. So Astos becomes a sitting duck that cannot really do much. It takes some time, but we are able to defeat him without any trouble. This lack of issues with the bosses continues as well. The next one is the Vampire, which is an undead. And if you remember what I mentioned before, white mages are good at dealing damage against undead enemies. So yeah, he ends up being a complete joke just like Astos. But after him it's time for Lich, the first of the 4 fiends. And for sure he's going to be hard, right? I mean, he is regarded as one of the hardest bosses you face early on, but usually you don't have 4 white mages. And I think I can tell by his look that he is an undead, which means that once again, he will have no chance against our party. He would be quite dangerous if not for the fact that we can kill him fairly quickly. And that's exactly what we do. It doesn't take long at all, and just like that, Lich is gone. That was the end of the easy part of the run, unfortunately. And we now face a second roadblock, in the form of Marilith, the second fiend. Actually, we have access to 2 different dungeons, Mangulg, where Marilith is, and the Cavern of Ice, which has a key item needed to get the airship. And by now I was feeling quite confident. The previous boss fights went surprisingly well, so maybe Marilith would have been the same. And that's why I decided to go for her. I was completely wrong. Marilith hit way too hard, and my party wasn't able to survive at all. Level 14 was simply not enough, and I think that not having Protera didn't help either. Unfortunately, I couldn't afford it yet. Money was a bit tight during this run. 4 white mages are quite expensive after all. You need to buy each spell for each character, so yeah, it takes a lot of money. Since Marilith was basically unbeatable, I decided to go to the Cavern of Ice and grind a bit there, given that there are undead enemies and they are fairly easy to fight. I ended up reaching level 20 or so, and honestly it didn't take that long. I even managed to complete the dungeon and get the key item. The boss protecting it, the Evil Eye, wasn't that hard. He could have been fairly dangerous if he decided to cast some spells, but he didn't, and it didn't take long for it to die. At this point I had some money, so I bought Protera for 1 character. Then, given that I had access to the airship, I decided to go to the Citadel of Trials, which is the place where you get the rat tail, that is the item needed to promote your characters. But I didn't go there for that. There's a specific item in that dungeon that's quite helpful. To be honest, in hindsight, I might not have needed it and could have skipped to the next dungeon, which has an even better item. But I didn't think it through, honestly. The Citadel of Trials is not that hard. You need to complete it in order to leave it, and at the end there is a forced fight against a couple of enemies. But they are undead, so they were kind of a joke for us. Anyways, the item I needed are the gauntlets, a piece of equipment that white mages cannot wear, but they can use it in battle in order to cast Tundara. And Tundara is going to be our best option to deal damage against Marilith. So time to try her again. This attempt went way better than before. The higher level helped a lot, and so did Protera, as well as Null Blaze, given that Marilith is fire elemental and uses fire spells. She can also inflict blind, and I didn't talk about it before, but blind is a status effect that halves your evasion and your accuracy, meaning that you are more likely to be hit and less likely to hit. But given that our main source of damage is a spell, that doesn't really matter, as spells are not affected by blind. Also, our other characters don't really need to attack, so they can focus on healing, making the fight a lot safer. And eventually Marilith goes down. It takes a very long time, but we were in control for the whole fight, so we had no chance to lose. The strategy of buffing our party members and then turtle through the fight has proven to be quite effective, and we will continue with that strategy, though we will add another buff, which will change how quickly we can defeat the bosses. And that buff is the Spell Saber, which increases attack and accuracy, and just like Protect and Blink, stacks with itself. If you remember, I showed you the spells that white mages can use, and Saber wasn't there. So how can we cast it? Well, just like Tundara and the gauntlets, there is an item that allows us to do that. The Giant's Gloves, found in the Sunken Shrine, which is the next dungeon we are going through. With this newfound power, it's time to find Kraken, the third fiend. It's even harder than Marilith, and things don't really look good at the beginning. The party members fall one after another. But the last one standing has been buffed enough not only to survive, but also to manage to win the fight. That just goes to show you how strong Protect, Blink and Saber actually are. 3 of the 4 fiends are now defeated, and we are only missing the last one, Tiamat. Once again we keep true to our strategy and buff our party members. Tiamat doesn't hit as hard as Kraken when it comes to physical attacks, but she has a lot of elemental abilities that usually deal a fair amount of damage. I said usually because we have the 3 ribbons that are in the game by now, and if you remember what they do, they have elemental damage and make us immune to status effects. So Tiamat is not as dangerous for at least 3 party members. That also saves us some time, since we don't really need to cast the null spells, as their effect doesn't stack with the ribbons. You probably saw that I'm using other items in battle. Those are casting heal, meaning that we don't waste our spell charges. With this setup we can survive basically forever. It's just a matter of time before Tiamat goes down. And down she goes. Now we are picking up pace, we are basically at the end of the game. What's left is the 4 refights against the fiends and the final battle against Chaos. The 4 fiends are stronger than before, they have higher stats and more abilities. But our strategy works fairly well and it continues to do so even in the refights. Once again we start with Lich, and we won't use the turtling strategy against him. We'll just spam Diaga. Lich is actually the most dangerous out of the 4 for us. He can cast Flare, which is non-elemental and cannot be mitigated, and will kill us in just 2 casts, so we need the fight to be over as soon as possible. Each cast of Diaga deals around 200 HP of damage, and luckily for us, Lich didn't really do that much and never used his most powerful abilities. So the battle ended up being fairly easy and quick. The order of the Fiend's fight is the same as before, so right after Lich we have Marilith. Both this fight and the one with Kraken later are basically the same. Neither of them is really dangerous, and as long as we can survive a couple of hits at the beginning we are basically safe. I just keep turtling up until I feel like the damage dealer is buffed enough, and then it takes a couple of turns or so for the bosses to die to their attacks, as you're seeing yourself. Next, and last, is Tiamat, but before her we finally have access to the Masamune, which is a weapon that every class can equip, and of course we will make use of it, given that it's a lot stronger than what we have right now. This Tiamat has an instant kill spell, but we are immune to it. Well, at least 3 of our characters are. One unfortunately died. No big deal, since we can always revive them later. That said, the strategy is always the same and Tiamat simply goes down, but this time we deal a lot more damage than before. Finally, it's time for Chaos, and he's pretty tough. We also are at level 23, which is not high at all, and our HP don't really look that good. A single cast of Flare might be enough to one-shot some of our party members actually. I decided to try anyways, but I wasn't really convinced I could win. And I died at the second turn. In hindsight, I could have played better and healed preemptively. But honestly, with that level it was basically impossible. I checked later and Flare would have one-shot at least 2 party members. And you don't really recover from that. So time to grind a bit. On the first floor of the Chaos Temple, there are some pretty easy enemies that cannot really do much, since they mostly inflict status effects, to which we are immune thanks to the ribbons, and don't have a lot of HP. So we can use the items that cast spells in battle in order to defeat them pretty quickly. After reaching level 27 I feel pretty confident about my party. Now their HP are higher, they have somewhat better stats, and more spell charges. Hopefully this is enough to beat Chaos. But my hopes were crushed. I even got pretty lucky, and Chaos kept casting haste, meaning that he was wasting turns since it doesn't stack. Yet I managed to lose fairly quickly. I made the same mistake as before and didn't really go for more preemptive heals. but it didn't really matter too much, given that my character was shot by physical attacks, which hit even harder thanks to haste. I never really explained what haste does. It doubles the amount of hits of attacks, meaning that it basically doubles the damage. Anyways, as I told you before, when a character is down it's pretty hard to bring them up again, given that they only have 1 HP and could die to any form of party-wide attack, unless you get lucky with the turn order. So yeah, that attempt wasn't successful. That's why I decided to grind a bit more once again. I brought up the party to level 33, 6 level higher than before. Unfortunately, our HP is still fairly low, and 2 consecutive flails will still kill us if we don't heal between them. The chances of that happening shouldn't be that high, but you never know. The AI is random after all. I didn't really talk about Chaos that much. He has a lot of HP, 20k, I mentioned this at the beginning. As you saw, his physical attacks are extremely strong, and he can even use haste in order to further increase their damage. He has an array of elemental and non-elemental abilities. The former are not really a big deal, we have the ribbons after all. But Cyclone, Tsunami, Earthquake and Flare can be quite problematic. Especially Flare. He can deal more than 300 HP of damage to the whole party, which is a lot. Also, there's no real way to mitigate magic damage. Well, non-elemental magic damage. Besides leveling up. And even that is kinda weird, given that magic defense is an hidden stat, which works based on thresholds. And the next one would be in a while, so that's not really an option. Lastly, you can use Slora, which is basically the opposite of haste, and halves the amount of hits of physical attacks, and he can also heal himself for 10k HP with Kuraja. You've been seeing the first few turns of this fight, and it doesn't look too bad. That's also because I finally changed my strategy a bit. This time around I started healing preemptively. Keeping my HP top is basically a necessity in this fight. I don't really care about wasting spell charges, given that I have 99 hitters. So yeah, the fight can last a very long time without me worrying about losing my ability to heal. And that's exactly what happened. I spent more than 20 minutes in that fight. By the end, my characters were so buffed that Chaos physical attacks could only deal damage in the single digits, barring critical hits of course. After setting up and while healing every single turn, it was basically impossible to die. And I didn't. The fight ended. I won. Chaos died. Honestly, it was a bit underwhelming. Maybe I leveled up a bit too much. Chaos wasn't even that hard, just tedious. And probably I could have beaten him by level 27 if I tried a bit more. The whole run wasn't really that difficult. I was almost never completely stuck, just against the Pisco demons, Marilith, I guess, but there was the Cavern of Ice, and obviously Chaos. And don't take me wrong, I died a lot, but to random encounters. The boss fights were mostly first tries, that's what I'm talking about. I expected to struggle a lot more than I actually did. But in retrospect, this is probably the easiest solo job challenge, given the access to white magic, which apparently it's extremely useful. Well, there's not really much else to say. There's a playlist in the description if you wanna check out the boss fight in full length, since it was impossible to put them in the video. And yeah, if you have any suggestion for a future run, please tell me. Any idea is welcomed. That's it. See you next time.